So Apple's newest iPhones are now here, and in the last video we looked at the Pro models, how they compare to each other, and to last year's Pros as well. In this video we're looking at the regular iPhone 14, and what exactly has changed from the 13 because, on the surface, it doesn't look like a whole lot. The bad news is that there's no more iPhone mini. That's something we expected, but the good news is that after a 5-year hiatus, the Plus model makes a return. So you can now get a big iPhone without having to pay the premium price for a Pro Max. And as many of you seem to agree with me from my 13 versus 13 Pro video last year, most of us don't need those Pro features anyway. So the new iPhone 14 Plus makes a lot of sense. But what about the regular 14? Given that Apple now sells the 13 at a discounted price, does the 14 offer enough to make that worth buying instead? Okay, so the unboxing is almost exactly the same as last year, and as always we just have the phone, the charging cable, and the usual paperwork. But just like the Pro models, the US versions of the iPhone 14 no longer have a physical SIM card tray. I'm personally a big fan of this change since multiple eSIMs can be stored on a single device, and they're also more secure since no one else can remove your eSIM like they can a physical SIM card. However, this can still make things like international travel more tricky, since in many cases it's not always as simple as just swapping a SIM card over. But we are slowly getting there, so I'm looking forward to a SIM-free future. The 14 follows the exact same design template as the 13, so they're almost indistinguishable aside from slightly larger camera lenses and being a fraction thicker, though weirdly also lighter. But this unfortunately means that phone cases for the 13 likely won't fit the 14. The only obvious difference are the new colour options. For instance, there's a new paler blue compared to last year's bolder finish, and the pink colour is replaced with this new purple, which I imagine will be the most popular choice this year. Durability in the materials are unchanged too, so we have the same aluminium frame, IP68 water resistance, and ceramic shield glass. The 14s also keep the same notch as before, so they don't get dynamic island, which the Pro models have. In fact, the entire display is the exact same one the 13s use, down to the same resolution, brightness, and the 60Hz refresh rate. The only change is that the Plus model offers a larger 6.7-inch display size, the same size as on the 14 Pro Max, but without the increased brightness and ProMotion tech of the Pro models. I understand the desire to keep a divide between these iPhones and the Pro models, but there are plenty of cheap, decent high refresh rate screens out there. Nothing's excellent Phone 1 proved this fairly recently. So for Apple not to update the iPhone 14 with one too is pretty inexcusable at this point. Apple's 60Hz displays are generally pretty smooth, arguably the best out there, and if you're switching from a 60Hz display anyway, then these are really only going to be an upgrade. But if you're used to a high refresh rate phone, then you're probably going to find these displays slow and choppy. Just bear that in mind. So visually, the 13 and 14 are pretty much identical, which immediately creates this sense that the 14 isn't actually an upgrade. Unless of course you've gone for the bigger 14 Plus, which is at least physically different. But that lovely bigger screen is great for gaming and movies, or simply making your content easier to see. Under the hood though, there has been a minor tweak. For the first time, the iPhone doesn't get Apple's latest chipset, and keeps the A15 Bionic as opposed to the 14 Pro's A16 chip. This isn't the same chip as in the iPhone 13 though, but rather the 13 Pro. So the 14s get a 5-core GPU, which does offer slightly increased graphics performance. The 14 actually clocked a slightly lower Geekbench 5 CPU score, but you will see consistently higher graphics test scores and a couple of extra frames per second when gaming. Part of me feels disappointed that Apple didn't give the 14s the A16 chip as well, but realistically I don't think it actually matters. Even the A15 Bionic is so far ahead of the competition, and real-world differences in performance between the 13 and 14 are so slight that the chipsets really don't matter. The storage options are the same, but the RAM is actually increased to 6GB now, which you may find helps with keeping apps open in the background. But from my use, I tend to find that iOS limits this before the RAM does anyway, so it's unlikely you'll actually spot any differences when using the phones. I think the type of person who cares that much about these tiny differences is already going for a Pro iPhone anyway, and essentially the performance and the experience using the phones is going to feel exactly the same. Some hardware changes worth pointing out though are the new antennas and G-force sensors, which enable the new emergency SOS features. So just like the Pros, the 14s get car crash detection and the ability to send an emergency message via satellite. As I said in the Pro video, these features are hard to get excited about since you'll likely never need to use them. But if you're buying a new phone to last you the next few years, as many iPhone 14 buyers will be, then having these potentially life-saving features may influence your purchase decision. What's important to point out though, is that whilst car crash detection is available for everyone, the emergency satellite feature is 1, starting in November, 2, only in the US and Canada, and 3, is only free for the first 2 years. So that actually kind of sucks, and I thought a company as rich as Apple wouldn't put up a paywall for a safety feature. But there we go. I was hoping the 14's slightly increased thickness was due to a new bigger battery, however teardowns have shown us that the size increase is only very slight. Apple's official specs list just 1 extra hour for video playback. But this was also the case for the Pros, which we later discovered actually have much poorer battery life than their predecessors. Unfortunately, I've also found this to be the case with the 14, it just doesn't quite last as long as the 13. Using the phones identically for a number of days, you'll actually see the same battery drop whether you're gaming, browsing the web and social media, or using the camera. So in a lot of tests, the phones appear to be the same, but leaving the phones overnight, I noticed I'd wake up to less battery with the 14. We know it's not the always-on display draining the battery because the 14 doesn't have one, but something about the standby mode is still draining battery faster with the 14, so at the very least don't expect improved battery, and you should prepare for it to be slightly worse. Of course, this completely changes with the Plus model. The major benefit of getting that is not just the larger screen, but the bigger battery as well. In fact, Apple claim the 14 Plus gives the best battery life on any iPhone, despite conflicting specs on their website listing the Pro Max as the battery champ. So it should come as no surprise that the Plus has excellent battery life, and is noticeably better than the 14, the 13, and definitely the 13 mini. Charging is basically unchanged, so you've got MagSafe wireless and Lightning, and you can fast charge the phones in pretty much the same time as the 13. Obviously, the chargers don't come in the box, so if you need one, then my recommendation is Anker's new Nano 3. If you watched my Pro video, then you've heard me talk about these tiny chargers before. This is the UK version, but look how small the US ones are. They have the power to fast charge all of the new iPhones at their fastest possible speed, plus they come with an intelligent thermal management system to keep your devices protected. You can pair this up with some excellent bio-based charging cables too, and they'll cost you a fraction of what Apple would charge you for their version of this. So I'll leave links to these down in the video description for you to check out. To avoid complete embarrassment, Apple have at least upgraded the cameras, well, on paper anyway. There's a new wider aperture and larger sensor main lens, which appears to be taken from last year's 13 Pro. Now, I already compared the 13 with the 13 Pro last year, and there was basically no difference with that main lens, only a small improvement with low light. The 14's ultra-wide is the same as last year's, whilst the TrueDepth selfie lens gets a new wider aperture, again to improve low-light images. Now it's easy to just look at the photo examples and say, yeah, there's literally no difference. And if you're not actively looking for any improvements, or if perhaps you're just going to look at these photos on a phone screen, you probably won't see any improvement with the 14. For the vast majority of situations, the 13 performs just as well as the new 14. Cropping in super close on those photos, you can spot minor differences like the increased contrast with the 14 here. That's something we saw with the Pros as well, so that's down to Apple's new Photonic engine and image processing. But something I consistently saw was improved zoom photos on the 14. Now there's still no telephoto lens, that's for the Pro iPhones only. But look at how much sharper the image appears to be with the iPhone 14. This is a 2x zoom shot that I've now cropped in on to give you a clearer view, and photos are not just a bit, but quite a lot better with the 14. Here's a 5x zoom shot from that same location. So this is now the maximum zoom for each phone, but even before cropping in, you can see the improvement. And then getting a closer look, you can really see just much better resolution all round, so this was an improvement I really didn't expect. Here's another example just to show this wasn't a one-off. So on the ultra-wide we see slightly greener colours, just like with the Pros. Then on the main lens you can see the brighter and warmer colours on the 14, but not much else is different. And now as we move up the zoom range from 2 to 3 to 5x, you can start to see the 14 pulling ahead with sharpness and detail. Finally, cropping in to give you a clearer view, there's no doubt that the iPhone 14 zoom shots look cleaner and less noisy, but you can also tell that this is a computational processing difference, because if you look at the text here, it's almost like the 14 is trying to over-sharpen or even smooth out that text. In fact, you could argue that it's easier to see that it says bar and rooftop with the iPhone 13 shot. Generally though, those zoom shots were better with the 14, but I guess the other thing to consider is how many people actually zoom in for photos on their iPhone 13 or 14. Without a dedicated telephoto lens, you're still really limited with zoom photography. So I wanted to point out the improvement, a surprise improvement actually, but I completely understand that most people won't benefit much from this. A quick note on portrait mode, there's a small change in that you can now blur the foreground as well as the background, and we do see that greener tint to the colours and a bit more contrast with the 14. But wider apertures and larger sensors become most effective in low light situations. We've seen already the slight boost this gave to the 13 Pro against the 13. However, I honestly struggled to see any obvious improvement with the iPhone 14. Whether it was the ultra-wide or the main lens, there was just barely anything in it between the phones, so that was actually quite disappointing. Taking zoomed night mode shots was slightly better, in the same way the daytime shots were, so I guess that's something, but I feel like people don't really take many zoomed low-light shots anyway. I certainly didn't see 2.5 times better low-light performance. However, there were rare occasions where the 14 had a faster capture time, so that could give you less motion blur for your low-light shots, but it's not something I often saw with my testing. Using the flash, however, was much better. Apple says this is a brighter flash with more consistent colours, and that's absolutely what I was seeing too. Just look at how much more consistent the colours are with the regular night mode shots. In fact, the results were remarkably similar to the 14 Pro, but this is not listed as the adaptive True Tone flash which the Pros got this year. So that's interesting, and maybe the better results are down to the improved colour science with the Photonic engine. Moving on to video, and just like the Pros, there's not a whole lot to say about the standard 4K video. It's very similar to last year's, so still amazing quality, with only a minor difference in those warmer colours. And now here's a night mode video example, and you just wouldn't be able to tell which phone was which. But remember that exaggerated shaking video test for the action mode feature? Well, that was done with an iPhone 14. So it's not just the Pros that get Apple's awesome new stabilization tech, and that is a nice upgrade over the 13. The 14 also gets cinematic mode in 4K and up to 30 FPS. I've mentioned before that some of the subject detection issues are still present here, but the 4x resolution bump from the iPhone 13 is a welcome upgrade. And finally, with the front cameras, we have that new wider aperture lens, which you can see gives a wider angle selfie. It's slightly more flattering, and along with the new autofocus feature, will make group selfies a lot easier. I think the colours are slightly better too, especially with the accuracy on skin tones, and the cutout with portrait mode is a little bit more precise as well. The most disappointing thing were the low light selfies, which, if anything, are less sharp and focused than on the iPhone 13. I saw this on the Pros as well, but the new wider aperture is supposed to specifically improve low light selfies, so I'm hoping this is a software issue that Apple can improve on. Selfie video was extremely similar. The 14 image is perhaps a tiny bit sharper, but then there's a bit more camera wobble as my foot hits the ground. So like the Pros, the stabilization may have taken a small hit, but there's really not much in it at all. So you can see that there's really very little that's changed with the cameras this year. In fact, in most situations, I think you couldn't tell which phone was which. Action mode and improved cinematic video are nice touches, but there's really nothing groundbreaking with the upgrades this year, and in many instances, the 13's camera is just as good as the 14's. With that being said, it only makes sense that Apple kept the pricing the same as last year, so it's $799 for the iPhone 14 and $899 for the 14 Plus. In the UK though, the phones are considerably more expensive, starting at $849 and $949, so that's another glorious benefit of our booming economy. There are no two ways about it, the iPhone 14 is the smallest upgrade ever for the iPhone, so much so that I personally don't think anyone should be considering it at all. The phone highlights the flaw with the annual cycle of new smartphones, and the truth is that there just aren't enough innovations in the industry to warrant a new iPhone every year. Apple realised this with the chipset and, perhaps sensibly, reused the A15 Bionic, but ultimately the iPhone 14 just didn't need to exist this year full stop, and it makes more sense to go for last year's model instead than ever before. Don't get me wrong, it's a slightly better phone than the 13. Here are the upgrades. And I know how tempting it is to be able to say I have the latest iPhone, but in no way are these upgrades justified by the $100 price jump, especially when Apple still sells the iPhone 13, now at a discounted price. They're actually still selling the 12 as well, but the 13's battery upgrade alone makes that worth paying extra for. Check out last year's comparison if you're still deciding between those two. So if you're looking for a more budget-friendly phone than a Pro, then I'd definitely recommend the iPhone 13 instead, or perhaps even the 13 mini for that super compact and comfortable form factor. As much as I personally love the mini, I do understand why it's gone this year. In recent years, lots of people ended up getting a Pro Max just because they wanted that bigger screen size and the bigger battery, so bringing those two features to a plus-sized iPhone 14 makes complete sense, and will now be the no-brainer choice for many people. The 14 Plus has the biggest screen and the best battery life on an iPhone, but is cheaper than Apple's Pro series, so it actually feels like an upgrade from the 13, and this is a phone I can comfortably recommend. Still, there's no doubt that Apple saved the best innovations for their Pro lineup, an intentional choice designed to increase the gap and push people towards the more expensive Pro iPhones. So if you're wondering whether this is the year the Pros are actually worth buying instead, well, I'll be exploring that very thing in the next video, comparing the 14 and 14 Plus directly with the Pro and Pro Max. So make sure you're subscribed and turn notifications on so that you're notified when that video goes live. Please give this video a like if you found it helpful, and leave any questions you want answered down in the comment section. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.